The most uncomfortable moment at that Thanksgiving table was not the food, the silence, or even the fact that Ethan had just come back from Wisconsin, carrying the kind of exhaustion that does not only come from driving for hours, because the real pressure started when Zach looked across the table and asked the question everyone could feel hanging in the room, even if nobody else wanted to touch it out loud. Ethan was not just visiting family for a holiday meal, and that is what made the whole scene feel heavier than a normal dinner conversation, because he was sitting there while everyone knew he was preparing to leave Georgia again, not for a confirmed relationship, not for a clear future, but for a woman he was no longer officially with, and still clearly could not let go of. That is why Zach's question hit so hard, because on the surface, he was asking where Ethan and Teegan stood, but underneath that, he was really asking whether Ethan was making a brave, emotional move or walking straight into another heartbreak with his eyes half open. And Ethan's answer did not make the room feel safer, because instead of giving a clear plan, a clear timeline, or a clear sign that Teegan wanted the same thing, he basically said he was going to move up there and give it a go, which sounds honest, but also dangerously open-ended when your entire life is being packed around one unresolved relationship. That is where the tension becomes more than romance, because Ethan is not simply chasing Teegan across state lines like this is some clean love story where distance is the only villain. Because the deeper issue is that he seems to be chasing the version of himself he wishes he had been the first time. He admits that Teegan felt last, and that matters, because those words change the meaning of Wisconsin completely. Since this is no longer just about where Ethan wants to live, it becomes his attempt to prove that this time he will show up. This time he will choose her. And this time, he will not let hesitation become the thing that breaks everything. But that is exactly why Zach's questioning feels so sharp. Because when someone is trying to turn a move into proof of love, the last thing they want is someone asking whether the proof is actually wanted by the other person. The family table becomes almost like a quiet relationship trial, with Ethan sitting in the middle of everyone's concern, Zach pressing for logic, Lydia watching the emotional temperature, and the rest of the family sensing that this decision could either help Ethan heal or pull him right back into a pattern he does not fully see yet. And the hardest part is that Teegan has not slammed the door completely, because Ethan says she told him the door is closed but not locked, which is the kind of sentence that can keep a hopeful person awake for weeks, replaying every word and trying to decide whether it means wait, try harder, or finally let go. That one line is powerful because it gives Ethan just enough hope to move forward, but not enough certainty to feel safe. And that is where viewers start splitting into two sides. Because some people will see him as a man finally taking action, while others will see a man building a future on a maybe. Zach may come across as intrusive, but the reason the moment works is because his questions are not completely unfair. Since if Ethan is moving across the country for Teegan, then someone has to ask, what happens if Teegan only wants friendship? What happens if the door stays closed? And what happens if Ethan calls this healing while quietly placing all of his hope in one person's answer? And Ethan's body language says almost as much as his words, because he does not seem excited in a simple way. He seems tired, anxious, and emotionally stretched between the family he is leaving and the relationship he is trying to repair. That is why this Thanksgiving scene matters more than it first appears, because nobody is screaming, nobody is throwing anything, and nobody has to become the villain for the tension to work, since the danger is quieter than that. The danger is that Ethan may believe Wisconsin can prove what words could not, while Teegan may still be deciding whether she even wants him close enough to prove anything. And once Ethan admits that Teegan felt last, the whole story shifts. Because now the question is not whether he loves her enough to move, it is whether moving is an apology that came too late, and whether an apology still means the same thing when the other person may only be willing to offer friendship. What makes Ethan's decision so difficult to judge is that it does not look completely reckless from the outside, because when he talks about Wisconsin, he is not speaking like someone chasing a random fantasy. He is speaking like someone who believes he has finally found the one action that can prove he understood where he failed. That is why the move feels heavier than a normal relationship choice. Because Ethan is not just saying he wants to live closer to Teegan. He is saying the relationship cannot work if he stays in Georgia. And once he says that, Wisconsin becomes more than a place on a map. It becomes his apology with furniture, his regret with a job plan, His attempt to turn words he already said before into something real enough that Teegan can finally believe him. But that is also where the danger starts, because Teegan has not promised him the version of the future he is moving toward. And that small difference changes everything. She has not told him they are fully back together. She has not said the relationship is repaired, and she has not given him the kind of clear yes that would make a move across the country feel emotionally safe. Instead, Ethan is holding on to something much more fragile, because the idea that the door is closed but not locked gives him just enough hope to keep moving, but not enough certainty to know whether he is walking toward healing or toward another rejection. And that kind of sentence can be dangerous when someone is already living inside regret, because a person who feels guilty does not always hear caution as caution. Sometimes they hear it as an invitation to try harder. That is why Zach's question starts to feel different after the first shock wears off, because at first it sounds like he is being too direct, too nosy, maybe even too comfortable stepping into something that is not his relationship. But the more Ethan explains himself, the more Zach's concern starts to sound like the question Ethan has not fully answered for himself. Is he moving because Teegan truly wants him there? Or is he moving because he cannot stand the idea that he failed to choose her when it mattered? That is the emotional trap in this whole situation, because Ethan may be trying to win Teegan back, but he may also be trying to forgive himself. And those two things can look almost identical until the other person does not respond the way he hoped. If Teegan softens, the move becomes romantic. If Teegan stays guarded, the same move can become painful pressure. And the more Ethan says he has to go, the more you can feel how much power has shifted in this relationship, because he is the one driving, planning, packing, leaving, and trying to prove change. But Teegan is still the one who decides whether any of that proof means romance again. That does not make Teegan cruel, and it does not make Ethan foolish, but it does make the situation emotionally uneven. He is moving with hope. She is responding with caution. He is trying to repair something. She is deciding whether repair is even possible. And hanging over all of that is another uncomfortable layer, because Ethan is still dealing with the legal end of his marriage to Olivia, which makes his desire for a new emotional beginning more complicated than it would be in a clean, finished chapter. For Teegan, that matters, because trusting someone who is still untangling a past marriage is not simple, even if his feelings are sincere, and even if his intentions sound better this time. So by the time Ethan says he does not really know what will happen, but he still feels like Wisconsin is where he needs to be, the whole story stops being a simple question of whether Zach crossed a line. Now it becomes a deeper question about whether Ethan is walking into a fresh start, or putting all his healing into the hands of someone who may only be willing to leave the door unlocked. And that is what his family seems to sense, even before anyone says it clearly, because they are not just watching Ethan move states. They are watching a pattern approach the edge again, and one person in that family understands the risk better than anyone, because Isaac is not only worried that Ethan might lose Teegan, he is worried that Ethan might lose himself trying to keep her. What makes this part of the episode so uncomfortable is that nobody at the table is completely wrong, and that is exactly why the conversation feels heavier than a normal family disagreement. Because Ethan believes he has to try, Zach believes the decision needs to make sense, and Isaac seems to understand that even a sincere effort can still destroy someone if they place too much hope in the wrong outcome. Zach's questions create the first kind of pressure, because he does not let Ethan hide behind vague words like, "we'll see," or "I'm just giving it a go." And while that can feel pushy in a room where Ethan already looks emotionally drained, it also exposes the part of Ethan's plan that still feels unfinished. He is moving to Wisconsin, but he cannot clearly say what Teegan has promised him. He cannot give a real timeline for how long he will try, and he cannot fully explain what happens if the same door he thinks is unlocked never actually opens again. That is where the audience starts to split. Because one side can look at Zach and say he is overstepping into someone else's relationship, especially when Ethan is not his brother, and their bond does not seem close enough for questions that personal. But the other side can look at Ethan and wonder why nobody else is asking the obvious thing. If a man is about to move across the country for an unclear relationship, after a breakup, while still carrying the emotional weight of a past marriage, then maybe hard questions are not cruelty. Maybe they are the last checkpoint before he turns hope into a moving plan. But Isaac's concern lands differently, because Isaac is not questioning Ethan like an outsider trying to solve a puzzle. He is speaking like someone who knows what Ethan looks like when he is wounded, and that gives his warning a different kind of weight. Isaac is not saying Teegan is the problem, and that matters, because this is not about turning her into the villain or acting like she owes Ethan a relationship just because he is willing to move. The deeper concern is that Ethan may be confusing effort with certainty, and those two things are not the same. You can drive across the country, find a job, change your address, and show up every day, but none of that can force another person to feel safe enough, ready enough, or in love enough to meet you where you are standing. That is the part Isaac seems afraid of, because he knows Ethan can go all in emotionally, and when Ethan goes all in, he may not leave himself enough room to survive the answer he does not want. So Zach and Isaac become two different versions of the same warning, even though they deliver it in completely different ways. Zach is asking for logic. Isaac is protecting the wound. Zach wants to know whether this move has a plan. Isaac wants to know whether Ethan has a way back to himself if the plan fails. And Ethan, sitting between those two pressures, still insists that he has to go. Because from his side, staying in Georgia feels like giving up before he has even proved that he can finally be consistent. That is what makes the scene morally tense, because Ethan's choice can look romantic, responsible, impulsive, and risky at the same time, depending on which part of the story you focus on. If you focus on his past promises to Teegan, then the move looks like accountability. If you focus on Teegan's uncertainty, then the move looks like emotional gambling. If you focus on Zach's questions, then the family looks concerned. If you focus on Ethan's face, then the whole thing starts to look like a man trying not to fall apart before he even leaves. And just when the conversation feels like it is already revealed enough, Ethan adds the detail that changes the whole direction of the story. Teegan is coming to Montana. That means the family's concern is no longer just a theory sitting around a Thanksgiving table. Ethan is about to be face-to-face with the person he is reshaping his life around. And once Teegan is in the same space as him, every question Zach asked and every fear Isaac carried will finally have somewhere to land. Montana is where Ethan's hope stops being protected by distance, because up until this point, everything could still live inside possibility, inside phone calls, inside what Teegan may have meant, and inside Ethan's belief that if he just got closer, if he just showed up, if he just made the move he once failed to make, then maybe the relationship could finally breathe again. But once he and Teegan are actually in the same place, the story changes. Because now the audience is no longer judging Ethan's plan from a Thanksgiving table, and the family is no longer debating a future that has not arrived yet. Now the question is standing right in front of him. And the first thing that becomes obvious is that being physically close to someone does not mean the emotional distance has disappeared. Because Ethan may be excited to travel with Teegan, he may see Montana as a chance to break the ice and soften whatever has been sitting between them. But the energy between them does not feel simple, warm, or clearly romantic. It feels careful. It feels restrained. It feels like Ethan is arriving with hope, while Teegan is arriving with boundaries. That is why even the small details start to matter more than they should. Because when they get there and the setup has these couple-coded touches, like flowers and a letter, it creates a moment that could have felt romantic in another version of this story. But here it feels almost uncomfortable. For Ethan, that kind of setup can quietly pull on everything he wants this trip to mean. For Teegan, it becomes something to downplay, something to explain away, something that does not need to become a signal. And that difference tells you almost everything. Ethan feels the weight of romance in the room. Teegan keeps the room neutral. That is the power shift this whole episode has been building toward. Because earlier, Ethan had movement on his side. He was driving, planning, packing, talking about jobs, saying he had to leave Georgia, and trying to turn action into evidence. But Montana makes one thing painfully clear. Movement is not the same as control. Ethan can travel with Teegan. He can invite her into the family trip. He can put himself closer to her world, and he can show that he is serious. But he cannot decide what his seriousness means to her. That decision belongs to Teegan. And that is where Zach's questions from Thanksgiving start sounding less intrusive and more relevant. Because if Teegan is still holding the relationship at a distance, then Ethan's move to Wisconsin becomes emotionally riskier than it already looked. The audience can see that Ethan is serious about trying, but they can also see that seriousness does not automatically create safety for the other person. Teegan is not fully shutting him out, and that is important, because she does not come across as someone completely done with him, but she is also not giving him the full romantic answer he seems to be hoping for, and that halfway space may be the hardest place for Ethan to stand. Because if someone fully rejects you, at least the pain has a shape. But when someone keeps the door unlocked while still standing behind it, hope can become its own trap. That is why Teegan's friendship framing lands with so much quiet force, because it does not humiliate Ethan, it does not explode into a fight, and it does not give the audience a clean villain. It simply reminds everyone that Teegan is not moving at Ethan's speed. She is not rewarding the risk just because he took it. She is not turning his relocation into an automatic second chance. And Ethan says he is okay with wherever the relationship is, even if they are just friends for now. But that answer raises the question viewers cannot ignore. Is he really okay with friendship? Or is he saying the safest thing because admitting he wants more would make the rejection feel too real? That is where the Montana trip becomes more revealing than Thanksgiving. Because at the table, everyone was worried about what might happen later. In Montana, later begins. Ethan's hope finally meets Teegan's caution in the same room, and the whole fantasy of Wisconsin as the fix becomes more fragile, because if Teegan only offers friendship while Ethan quietly wants romance, then Wisconsin may not be a fresh start at all. It may be the place where Ethan has to learn whether he can love someone's boundary without using his own sacrifice as a reason they should move it. The hardest truth in this whole situation is that Ethan's real test was never whether he could move to Wisconsin, because moving is physical, moving is visible, moving gives everyone something to point at and call proof. But the deeper test is whether Ethan can stand close to Teegan without turning that closeness into pressure, expectation, or quiet heartbreak. That is why the episode does not need to fully answer whether Ethan and Teegan get back together, because the more important answer is already sitting underneath every scene. Ethan is moving from regret. Teegan is moving from caution. Zach is reacting to the risk. Isaac is reacting to Ethan's history. And the family is watching a man try to fix something that may not be fixable just because he finally found the courage to act. That is what makes the story feel heavy without needing anyone to become the villain. Because Ethan's feelings can be sincere and still dangerous for him. Teegan's distance can be painful and still necessary for her. Zach's questions can feel intrusive and still be fair. And Isaac's warning can sound uncomfortable while still coming from love. The real tension is not that one person is right and everyone else is wrong. The real tension is that everyone may be seeing a different part of the same truth. Ethan sees the promise he broke when Teegan felt last. Teegan may see the emotional risk of trusting someone who is still trying to prove he has changed. Zach sees a man preparing to move across the country without a clear romantic answer. Isaac sees his brother walking toward a situation where effort may not protect him from pain. And that is why Wisconsin cannot be treated like some magic fix. Because a new address can make Ethan closer to Teegan, but it cannot make Teegan ready. It cannot erase the past. And it cannot turn friendship into romance just because the sacrifice was big. That is the emotional trap Ethan has to avoid. If Teegan only offers friendship, he has to decide whether he can live honestly inside that boundary, or whether he will call it friendship while secretly waiting for her to change her mind. Because those are two very different things. One is respect. The other becomes pressure, even if he never means it that way. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Ethan and Teegan, because the Thanksgiving table and the Montana trip both reveal the same pattern from different angles. At Thanksgiving, the family asks what Ethan is doing. In Montana, Teegan's distance asks why he is doing it, and neither question gives him the easy answer he wants. That is why Isaac's concern may matter later, because if Wisconsin does not become the romantic reset Ethan is hoping for, Ethan may need someone who can tell him the truth without trying to shame him for loving too much. And Zach's role may also keep causing friction, because once someone publicly questions your emotional decision, it is hard not to feel judged, even when the question had a point. Teegan's guarded stance may become the emotional filter for every scene after this, because viewers will not just watch what Ethan does now, they will watch whether Teegan softens, whether she stays careful, and whether Ethan can keep showing consistency without silently demanding a reward for it. That is why this episode works as more than a breakup recap. It becomes a story about missed timing, emotional debt, family concern, and the painful difference between proving change and being chosen again. Ethan may truly want to be different, and maybe moving to Wisconsin is his way of finally becoming the person he wishes he had been sooner. But proof only goes so far when the other person has not given a clear yes. So the final question is not whether Ethan loves Teegan enough to move. He already answered that. The real question is whether Ethan can love her enough to respect the boundary that might hurt him, because if he cannot, then Wisconsin will not be the beginning of healing. It will be the place where hope slowly becomes another wound.